I am sorry you feel that way. 5 words. Grammatically, it resembles an apology. Psychologically, it functions as a flawless evasion of liability. You presented a legitimate emotional injury, and within seconds the offender weaponized your own reaction against you, transforming themselves into the victim of your sensitivity. Imagine holding a freshly printed page. The ink is still wet, the paper is heavy in your hands, and right in the center, there is a glaring, painful error. You take it to the master printer. You ask them to fix the typo. But instead of changing the letter, they look you dead in the eye and claim the dictionary is wrong. Welcome to the mind of the chronic non-apologizer. We are experiencing a mass epidemic of relationship fatigue and social burnout right now. And it is not because we are simply working too many hours or managing too many responsibilities. It is because we are completely exhausting our emotional reserves trying to extract basic accountability from people who are structurally incapable of giving it. I have found myself in situations where I actively changed how I communicated, carefully tiptoeing around an issue, just to avoid triggering someone who refuses to admit fault. Not because I was afraid of their anger. I did it because I could not stomach the sheer exhaustion of the ensuing argument. Yielding to them in those moments was not forgiveness. It was a desperate attempt to conserve my own peace. But yielding is not condoning. And eventually, the ledger runs out of space. Behavioral profiling points to a stark contradiction in how people process fault. Highly secure individuals operate on a basic psychological partition. An error is an event. It is external. It is dynamic. If you make a mistake, you highlight the text, hit delete, and the document, your core identity, remains entirely intact. But for the chronic non-apologizer, this partition does not exist. They suffer from severe identity fusion. Consider a recent confrontation. You are sitting in the passenger seat of a car. It is raining. You calmly bring up a boundary they crossed the night before. Before you even finish the sentence, the air in the cabin changes. Their grip on the steering wheel tightens, and suddenly, they are reciting a completely fabricated sequence of events where their specific mistake was actually the correct, necessary action. Your memory is the thing that is flawed. And here is what I keep wondering about that exact moment. What would happen if you stopped trying to correct their timeline? What if you simply accepted that they are reading from a completely different, fabricated ledger? The reason they do this has nothing to do with dominance. They do not operate like a modern word processor. They operate like an obsolete 19th century linotype machine. In a linotype press, words are not individual movable letters. The ego is cast as one solid, continuous block of lead. To admit a single flaw, to say, "I handled this poorly," means acknowledging the entire block is defective. Admitting fault is not a minor correction. It is a total structural collapse. It requires throwing the entire lead plate into the scorching melting pot. It is heavy, it is rigid, and it is utterly terrified of change. When they offer the classic non-apology, what they are actually doing is intentionally smudging the ink. They deliver the phrase to blur the page. They shift the blame onto your reading comprehension, your sensitivity, your flawed vision. They did not fix the plate. They just blurred your vision. When a highly rigid mind encounters undeniable proof of its own wrongdoing, it experiences acute cognitive dissonance. The brain cannot hold two conflicting truths: the internal baseline that I am a flawless person and the external fact that I caused severe harm. To resolve this agony, they do not change their behavior. They commit psychological perjury. They run a revisionist press, actively rewriting the historical record until they are completely exonerated. You can tolerate this for a short while. One mistake is an anomaly. Two is a coincidence. But by the third strike, the pattern becomes an undeniable diagnosis of their deficit. Forgiving someone who fundamentally lacks the capacity to recognize their own errors is a statistical impossibility. You cannot pardon a machine that does not recognize it has caused a fatal injury. The limit of your patience is not a character flaw. It is a vital boundary of self-preservation. The environment that built this psychological structure usually demanded absolute perfection. An early dynamic where vulnerability was met with a severe penalty forged this solid, unyielding block of lead. That version of them was protecting something real, but the environment changed. The original threat is gone. The pattern is maintained today by a present refusal to look inward. They are the only ones in a jurisdiction to dismantle it, which is, frankly, an exhausting amount of cognitive framing to dedicate to avoiding a simple admission of guilt. Yet, you are the one carrying the weight. You are burning your own social capital trying to fund their emotional insolvency. You are not a victim of their missing backspace button. You are a volunteer who keeps bringing your manuscript to a broken press because you are terrified of publishing it yourself. If you step back and observe the dynamic objectively, the absurdity of it becomes entirely clear. You are sitting in the same room, having two completely different conversations. You are trying to resolve an interpersonal conflict. They are fighting a war for their own psychological survival. That is why your logic never penetrates. You are speaking the language of connection, and they are speaking the language of ego preservation. True success, real human strength, requires the profound courage to admit when you are wrong. A person with the genuine strength to own their failures is an individual who has mastered their own reality. The chronic non-apologizer does not possess this courage. They are trapped in a prison of their own infallibility. You have been waiting for them to validate your pain so you can finally heal. But look at the structure you are dealing with. You are agonizing over a typo, waiting for an apology that is structurally impossible. You are begging a 19th century printing press for a digital backspace button. It is not that they simply choose not to say sorry. It is that they literally lack the psychological capacity for it. The refusal to take accountability is not a display of power. It is the desperate flailing of an emotionally stunted structure terrified of ego death. You do not need the pressmen to issue a formal erratum to prove you were hurt. Stop arguing with the machine. If there is someone in your life who is currently running this exact revisionist press, pass this ledger to them. Let the text speak for itself. Healing from this dynamic requires a brutal decoupling. You must sever your emotional closure from their accountability. Waiting for an emotionally rigid individual to validate your reality is a zero-sum game that bankrupts your peace. The ink is dry. The question is no longer how to make them read it. The question is what you are going to do with the rest of your blank pages. The press is never going to stop running.